Okay, Lindsay, tell us about yourself. How'd you get into the Titanic?
Well, I wasn't really into the Titanic at all. It was my publisher wrote to me in about 2018, and she said, well, she's a kind of educational publisher, and I'd written stories, fantasy books and things for another publisher, and then I'd sent this publisher, Cranachan Books, a book about a historical novel about Paisley, and she'd published that. It was a Victorian book, and it did pretty well locally. And then she wrote to me and she said, why don't you set a children's novel on Titanic? Because it's really popular in schools, particularly down south and primary 7 in Scotland, which is kind of 11-year-olds. And at first I thought, oh my goodness, this is a bit overwhelming. There's so much information out there. How on earth do I kind of narrow this down and make a book that children will want to read? And she'd suggested giving it a Scottish twist. And I thought, well, how can I really? So it was going from Southampton to New York. Mm-hmm. It stopped in Cherbourg, it stopped in Queenstown, it didn't go anywhere near Scotland. And it was built in Belfast, it wasn't a Clyde-built ship. So I wondered at first about maybe inventing a character, a Scottish character. And then I read that fact about Joseph Dawson's grave being really popular because people visited it believing, because it said J. Dawson on his headstone, that it was Jack from the movie.
Right.
I thought I don't actually want that happening in my book. I don't want children getting confused. So I thought, well, I'll make sure that I'm writing about somebody who actually existed. So I had a look at the first class passenger list, and obviously there were children on the ship, but they were mainly going home. They were traveling home. They weren't. I wanted my main character to be starting a new life. I wanted it to be a big deal. So I looked at the second class passenger list and I found Bertha. Bertha Josephine Watt. She was 12. So she was absolutely perfect. She was the right age for a children's book. She was from Aberdeen, so she gave me my Scottish twist. And she was traveling with her mum, which was super important. I didn't want a terrible personal tragedy for my main character at the end of the story. So the fact that her dad was already safely in America was really important, and made all the difference really for telling the story. It was also lovely because I was writing about this real life character. So obviously she had descendants, and I managed to get hold of Bertha's granddaughter, Nancy, who still lives in Oregon, and we spoke by email, and she was able to tell me a little bit about what her granny had told her about being on Titanic. Even though I was using, first-hand accounts, really, you've got to be careful, you've got to cross-check everything. And I did really enjoy using Bertha as my main character because she came across, as quite a dramatic girl, quite energetic, quite fun. Gymnastics was her favourite subject at school, so I knew she was quite kind of physically confident, and so I had great fun writing her character. It was a lovely book, but I needed somebody to show a contrast, the readers, the contrast, particularly that age group, between life for first and second passengers and life in third class, and how difficult it was, particularly during the sinking. So I found another passenger who his story is kind of equally important. The chapters are told from Bertha's perspective, and then from my third class passengers. He was called Johan Serban Svensson, and he was traveling on Titanic by himself. He was alone. His dad and his elder sister had gone to America a few years ago, and the dad had written to the mum saying, I need help on the farm, send Johan. So Johan had been put on a ship from Sweden to Hull, and then he'd got a train from Hull down to Southampton, and he got onto Titanic all by himself, only 14 years old and unable to speak English. And when I read that fact, I have to say, oh my goodness, I thought, I can't do this. How am I going to write a story for kids where the two main characters can't speak to one another? I thought, this is impossible. And I thought, I'll just tell a lie. I'll give him English. And then I thought, well, actually, that's really unfair to the real boy because, on the night of the sinking, Johan had a terrible problem. He couldn't speak English. He managed to climb up ladders on the outside of the ship to get up to the boat deck. He really used his initiative. He was so brave. And then he got onto a lifeboat, and then he was shoved off again by an officer shouting, women and children first, you coward. And, you know, he couldn't understand why they weren't letting him save his own life. It must have been an absolute nightmare. So I told his story. I told his story as well as Bertha's, and it was a privilege really to be able to tell their really inspiring stories. But obviously I needed a plot. You know, I had to have something for my characters to do. I couldn't just have them kind of sipping tea and playing quoits, and I didn't want it to be like the movie where you're kind of waiting for the ship to sink. You know,
Right.
come on, you know, this is going on and on. I thought I need them to have an adventure, because obviously they don't know that the ship's going to sink. So I have to give them something exciting to do, and that's where the whole idea of the Titanic Detective Agency started. And I was at last month's talk about the Stars in April, the book about Ruth Becker, and it was really interesting because she was talking about the Navratil brothers, Edmund and Michelle, and that became actually, that was kind of one of the plots in one of the mysteries that the Titanic Detective Agency trying to solve. In my book, Bertha gets together with Madge Collier, Marjorie Collier, who's also on the ship. She's an 8-year-old who's traveling with her parents, Charlotte and Harvey, and they get to know one another. And I know from Bertha's account that they played together in the ship. So in my story, what they do is they get together and they form this detective agency to try and solve both the mystery of the Swedish boy with the treasure map and also the real life mystery of Mr. Hoffman and what he's doing, you know, why he's got those 2 little boys and what's going on. Because Bertha did say in her account that she was suspicious of him. I don't know how much of that is just, you know, hindsight talking, but she did say that she had her suspicions because he wouldn't let her speak to the boys in French. She had some schoolgirl French that she wanted to show off, and he was very keen that she didn't speak to his boys, and so she thought there was something going on. And so the whole plot revolves around Madge and Bertha trying to solve the mysteries on the Titanic, and then of course it all kind of falls apart because the ship starts going down, and life, instead of being a big adventure, a big game, it becomes really serious life and death situation. Unfortunately, Madge's, the younger girl, her dad doesn't survive. He goes down with the ship, taking all the money with them, all the life savings that Madge's parents were going to start a fruit farm in Idaho. And when they got to America, you know, obviously that was impossible because the dad was dead. There was only Charlotte and Madge left, and poor Charlotte was dying of tuberculosis. So poor Madge, she was in a really difficult situation. And that was one of the problems about writing about real life characters. You know, you want to give them all a happy ending, particularly in a children's book, and it wasn't possible. But I was very lucky that Bertha did have her happy ending. You know, she survived Titanic. Her mum survived, and the first thing her mum did when they got off the boat was take Bertha out on a boat trip. She felt it was really important that Bertha didn't grow up afraid of water. And, you know, it worked because as Bertha grew up, she became a very keen sailor. She married a dentist and they moved to Canada, and they lived in British Columbia on an island that could only be reached by boat. So, you know, it really did work. Our mother was a bit of a hero, I feel. She was a real courageous and sensible woman. And when the ship did start sinking, she didn't panic at all. She was very cool, very calm. And when she got onto the lifeboat, the sailor who was assigned to that lifeboat wasn't very good at rowing, and she took the oars, and she was quite a strong rower. She used to row in Loch Ness, and she was rowing the boat and singing songs and trying to. And when she got onto Carpathia, she was sewing clothes for people who had come off in their night clothes. You know, she was making skirts for the girls and comforting widows. And I just thought, what a hero! You know, absolutely, to be able to think of others when she's just gone through such a traumatic time. I just felt Bertha's mum was the kind of person you'd want to be in that kind of situation. She really showed people how it's done. So she became kind of almost like the hero of my book, which I just thought was a lovely situation. That only happened because I was able to speak to Nancy, you know, Bertha's granddaughter, and she told me what kind of person Bessie Watt had been, Elizabeth Watt, and Bertha's mum. And so, yeah, it was lovely to get those kind of connections. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get in touch with Johann's family I tried. I left a note on their website. They have a family tree website, and I left a little note just saying that I've written a book about Johan. If you want to get in touch, and I'll send it to you. Please do. But I got no response, so I'm still hoping and waiting that they'll get in touch. So that's my book. That's all about it. It was an absolute joy to write. It was a lot of work to do all the research. But as soon as I found my characters, I felt it was much easier because I could just focus on them and I didn't have to kind of think about what was happening to everybody else. Though you do get so obsessed with it, I found myself going down all these rabbit holes of research, finding out about people that I didn't need to find out because they weren't actually in the book. But I'd become really interested by that time. It was, I think, my favourite book to write. I just loved it, every minute of it.
Okay, well, I want to know, besides the research, which story did you find difficult to write?
There was a lot less information out there about Johan. There was only a few facts from the Red Cross, really, and a little bit on the family tree website about their family and where they'd come from. And I had a photo of him, showing him with his 4 little brothers and his 2 older sisters, his mum and dad. So I had a kind of idea of his family, and I knew roughly what happened to him in later life. But it was more difficult. I had more information about Bertha, so I could kind of create her more easily, as a kind of rounded person. It was trickier to do with Johan. I just had to kind of put myself in his shoes and think, how would I feel? I'm leaving all my little siblings. I'm leaving my mum. I'm only 14. I can't speak English. I'm on this, I thought he must be anxious. He must be. So the whole story, his story is really all about his feelings and how I imagined them. So that was difficult. It was difficult, but also really rewarding.
I don't know what I would have felt in that poor kid's place. I mean, he can't speak English. Mm-hmm. That also, the fact that many of them couldn't speak English has contributed to why so many of them died.
Yeah, absolutely.
They couldn't speak English. They didn't know which end was up. They're in this massive ship that's sinking. Actually, they were the first to realize that the ship was sinking because a lot of the water was coming up.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And no instructions, in Swedish, and there were so many Swedes on board. You would have thought kind of like, and having had no lifeboat drills at all, no practice, no information about where they should go in an emergency, only really being told you're not allowed in that area, and yet those were the areas they needed to be in when the ship started sinking. It must have been dreadful. And the vast majority of children who died on Titanic were 3rd class, so it definitely was a disadvantage. There's no question of that.
I mean, how many people died? How many kids died between the first 2 classes?
One,
yeah. Yes. And it's like, what, 59? I want to say it's 59.
I think there was definitely 49. I'm not sure if there was more. There might well have been. I
can't remember how many kids died, but it was quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Johan, it was remarkable. He did manage to survive. As I say, he was following up. There was 2 Lebanese children on board who were going up the ladder, and he was following behind them. And they managed to go up a series of ladders to get up the boat deck. And the fact that they managed that, young children showing that kind of initiative is really, I think, quite startling that they managed to get up there in the first place, and he did manage to get, I think, onto the 3rd lifeboat that he attempted. So he did manage to save his own life, basically, eventually. But no thanks to any officer on board. He really had to do it all himself. And he was treated very much as a grown man. When you see a photograph of Johan, he looks like a little boy. He looks even younger than 14. And the fact that, he was getting shoved off, saying, treated as an adult, it just seems shocking now. But it just seems strange to us. But I suppose when there were 14, 15-year-old boys working on the ship, then you can see, adulthood came earlier in those times. And it just seems awful now, but that's how it was, I guess. He did. I mean, he did get off, and he lived, Johan, until his 80s, He married twice. He moved to California. He had a little girl called Joy. So his life did work out in the end. He never talked about Titanic. Bertha did. She was on Canadian television speaking about her experiences, which I think probably helped her. I think being able to talk about what happened must have made all the difference. It was like last week when we were saying that Ruth Becker's mum never spoke of it and told them not to speak about it. I think that must have been so damaging for these children. You've gone through something completely traumatic. You need to discuss it. You can't just kind of pretend it didn't happen. But I think that was the way things were in those days. That it was just to be brushed under the carpet and never spoken of again. But as I say, Bertha did talk about it. So it maybe just helped her to process everything. The fact that she, as soon as she got off the ship, she wrote it all down. That must have been quite cathartic as well. I think getting out there about how she felt on the night and how she felt like clinging to her mum. And after, when she was on Carpathia, she couldn't eat for 2 days. She couldn't, and it was her mum basically said, "Look, there are people here much worse off than we are. We've survived. We've got our dad safely in Oregon. We're okay." I'm going to think about those who aren't, because as I say, poor Madge, who's 8 years old, so young, and she was it was just her and her mum left, and her mum went to a women's magazine, I believe, and sold her story, but they didn't cope. They couldn't, there was no way that this woman with tuberculosis, last stages of tuberculosis, really could start a fruit farm. It just wasn't going to happen. So she ended up going back to England and taking Madge with her, and remarried, much to her dead husband's family's disgust. I think they were furious with her. And then she died. She died really young, just a couple of years later. And then so Madge was orphaned by about the age 10. And then her stepfather died, and she was brought up by her uncle, who wasn't very kind to her, I don't think. And she married very young, had a baby. The baby died, and then her husband died in his 40s. So Madge said, actually, she said to Walter Lord, when he wrote to her about his book, she said, "I didn't have any luck after Titanic." And, she wasn't wrong. She just said disaster after disaster. And it is, as I say, really difficult when you're writing about an 8-year-old girl, a beautiful little girl like Madge. You want to give her that happy ending, but when you're writing about a real life character, you got to see it as it is, and it was difficult. I think I managed to give it my book a really positive ending. I think because I kind of focused on Bertha at the end of the story, and when the whole Orphans of the Titanic mystery is solved, it's quite kind of positive and happy, because their mum's coming to get them, and that feels like a positive ending.
Right.
Yeah, but it was, it's a difficult story to tell, isn't it? When your children are very, very interested in it, and that's not surprising, but you've got to be careful that you're not giving them nightmares and giving them a story that's too harrowing. So if you ever go to Ireland, definitely go to the Titanic Museum at Belfast, because it's just so good. It's really fascinating. And I used it. I mean, I'd done most of the research for the book by the time I visited, but there was just like little artifacts on show that I ended up including. Like there's a tobacco tin, and it was Gallagher's 2 Flakes tobacco, and I thought I'm going to use that, incorporate that, and that became the treasure box.
Goodness.
There's things like that just seeing them, kind of brings it all home, doesn't it? That stuff.
What were you saying? What would you say you saw?
A tobacco tin.
It's a tin of tobacco. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, and it just said Gallagher's 2 Flakes tobacco, and it had been one of the workers who was working on Titanic, and I just used it in the story. It just became one of the items.
You have a lot of how can I say this? Do they have a lot of artifacts?
Yeah, quite a few. Not as many as I think some of the museums in America has, but there are some. Yeah, there's quite a few things that were there. But it's just beautifully done. There's survivor stories, and they tell their stories, so you can kind of sit and listen. And then there's a film bit where you see the underwater, the Titanic wreck, and this is very nicely done. You're kind of walking through from the building of the Titanic. You actually go on a kind of ride thing. You sit in a little chair and they take you through like the building of the Titanic, so you can hear the rivet, the noise that the rivets make, and how tall it was. You get the impression of the size of it all, and then you go and see the mock-ups of the cabins and all the rest of it, and then to the sinking. And yeah, it's very good. It's very well done. Really, really worth the visit.
It's really worth visiting.
Yeah.
And then they have what about the gift shop?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. Though I did write to them. I said, look, what about stocking my book? You know, I've got this new book set in Titanic, and they said, oh, I think we've got enough children's books just now. And I thought, oh, come on, please.
If I ever got there, you would have to keep me away from the gift shop because I would buy everything.
They've got loads of stuff, but not my book yet. Because as I said, I wasn't particularly, you know, I'd watched the movie and all this, but I wasn't a woman obsessed before I started writing the book. But once, you know, it draws you in, doesn't it? Once I was doing the research for the book, I became absolutely fascinated. And now the idea of a Titanic museum really, really appeals. Whereas before I just thought, right, okay. But yeah, it definitely pulls you in. Such a fascinating subject. I found some of the stories just so inspiring. I thought it was just incredible how brave people managed to be in such terrible circumstances. I also find it quite sad the way men in particular were judged, you know, the ones that did survive, and how they felt they had to kind of tell fibs about how they survived. You know, the fact that kind of 80 of them said that they'd jumped into the sea and swum about and got picked up by a lifeboat, but actually there's only really 5 or 6 that actually happened to. And yet when you read their stories, the survivor stories, you can absolutely understand why they did that, why you wouldn't want to have the stigma of being a person who just walked onto a lifeboat. And do you want me to do a wee reading from the book? Would that be okay if I just?
That'd be great. I'd love to hear it. Yeah, I was going to say, why don't you read something from the book?
Yeah, I'll just read a little. I'll read a little bit from chapter 17. It's okay. Bertha, 15th of April, 1912. Bertha, mother's voice, quiet but urgent, broke through her dream. Bertha, wake up. We've got to get up and go on deck. Bertha opened her eyes, groggy, her dream dissolving as reality encroached. What's happening? Is it morning? Her mother shook her head. No, it's just past midnight. Come along. There's no time to lose. Bertha threw off her blankets and clambered down from her bunk. Is it a drill? Seems not. That's a good lass. Put your coat on over your nightie. It'll be freezing out there. No, leave your books, Bertha. Reluctantly, Bertha put down the stack of books she'd lifted from her trunk. It would be a dull wait up on deck with nothing to do. Where have I put my blue scarf? That very night I need it, and it's missing. Bertha gulped. She knew exactly where Mrs. Pinsky's blue scarf was. She'd forgotten to return it. Giving up on the scarf, Rosa bundled herself into a plaid shawl. This is not what I paid for when I bought my ticket, she grumbled. Comfort and luxury, they told me. The shawl made Mrs. Pinsky look like one of the fishwives who worked in the harbour at Peterhead, but it seemed rude to tell her, especially when her eyes were creased with anxiety. And when Bertha glanced at her own reflection in the wardrobe mirror, she figured it would be pot calling the kettle black. Pale-faced, shadows under her eyes, dressed in a white cotton nightie, and with her hair in ratty tangles, she looked less than glamorous herself. Rosa was still muttering away as she hauled a life jacket over her head. I'm sure the brochure said the Titanic's virtually unsinkable. There was certainly no mention of lifeboats. Lifeboats? Bertha remembered the lifeboats hanging from davits over the side of the ship. Imagine being lowered down in one of those tiny boats in the middle of the night into the deep, dark sea, miles below. Her mother must have noticed Bertha's expression. Don't get wound up like a clockwork mouse, Bertha. Get your coat, button it up to the neck, and put on your hat. While Bertha fetched her hat and coat, she bumped into Ellen Toomey, who was bustling around the cramped cabin, loading her possessions into her carpet bag. Will you watch where you're going, child? I nearly dropped my rosary beads. Pop the beads in your coat pocket and put the bag down, Ellen. They'll not let you take it. Bertha started at her mother's sharp tone. She noticed her mouth was a tight line, her face drawn. Panic fluttered like a moth in her chest, and she grabbed her mother's hand. What's wrong, Mother? Is this definitely not a drill? No, I've told you already. They wouldn't consider having a drill on such a cold night as this one. They're having trouble of some kind. She plonked Bertha's life jacket over her head. It was heavy, awkward and uncomfortable, but wearing it made her feel safer. At least if she fell out the lifeboat into the sea, she wouldn't sink. With all the cork in this life jacket, she'd bob around in the water for ages, and she was quite good at swimming. Her backstroke was particularly strong. Mind you, they must be some distance from land. She opened her mouth to ask how far, but Rosa Pinsky spoke first. Who told you there was trouble, Bessie? She asked, her plump fingers trembling as she struggled to fasten her own life jacket. Did the steward knock? I didn't hear him. Mother shook her head. While she buckled Bertha into her life jacket, she told the others what she knew. I couldn't sleep, so was reading by lamplight when I heard a loud sound, rather like crashing glass, or marbles rolling across a baking tin. I threw on my dressing gown and went up to deck to investigate. There were lots of people milling around, which seemed odd when it was so late. I saw Captain Smith, Mr. Ismay and Mr. Andrews, all wearing very glum expressions. They were in deep conversation and I didn't feel I should approach them, so I marched up to an officer and asked him what the matter was. He said very firmly there was nothing wrong and I should go straight back to bed. There was something shifty in his expression, though, and I knew he was lying, but wasn't sure what to do next. I was about to head back downstairs when Mr. Collier approached, quite shaken. He pointed out to sea at this dark shape, which I could hardly believe I hadn't noticed, and he told me we'd hit an iceberg. I asked if all was well, and he shook his head and whispered he'd just seen a first-class lifeboat being lowered. He took my hand, insisted I should go and collect my little girl and get up on deck. Before I scurried off, he said we should put our life jackets on, and I think we'd be wise to heed his advice. Mr. Collier does not seem the type of person to cause unnecessary alarm. Bertha's heart began to thud against her ribs. What about everyone else? Aren't they going to get into the lifeboats too? What about the crew, little Lolo and Mom, and what about Reginald? She blushed, embarrassed she'd singled out the lift boy. But her mother was too busy battling Bertha's worries aside to even notice. They'll put us all in lifeboats, you see, just to be on the safe side. It'll be fine, Bertha, I promise. Please don't worry. Chin up, ladies, let's go. As they lumbered out the cabin, awkward in the heavy life jackets, Bertha's stomach lurched. She was reluctant to voice the questions preying in her mind. If the ship has really hit an iceberg, if the crew are already lowering the lifeboats, why did the steward tell Mum to go back to bed? Is it because there isn't enough room for everyone? Fear prickled her insides as she thought of the stokers deep down in the engine room, of Reg trapped at his lift, of Johann in his third-class cabin in E-deck. She hoped they all had a Mr. Collier to tell them what was going on and were headed up to the lifeboats. She prayed they were not being told by the steward, there's nothing the matter, go back to bed, because there was something terribly wrong. She could feel it. For the first time, she'd become aware that the steady thrum of the engines had stopped, and the absence of sound was chilling. And that was them having hit the iceberg, about to try and get onto a lifeboat.
Wow. God, that sounds great. It sounds like a great book.
Yes, yes, it
That
is.
is awesome. That sounds just as chilling as a thriller novel or something.
Well, I wanted to make it exciting, but at the same time not too frightening, for children. So it's very much based on Bertha and what she sees and what she hears. So that there's obviously it's going to be you're not going to get an event where 1,500 people are killed and be able to have your kind of happy ending. But as I said, I tried to make it as positive as I could, so that children come away feeling satisfied with the story. And it was a joy to write. It really was an absolute joy. I love telling their stories.